fries are done. That's how I feel about it every time it dings. There's a charm to it, to me.
Yeah.
Zoom is fabulous. Okay, hello. Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good evening, I guess, too, depending on where you are in the world. But welcome to the Eat and Greet today, where we've got Spencer Michaud with us, and we are going to talk about the planets in astrology. It's this is the most basic topic, but I feel like every time it comes to the table, you can always go deeper. You can know, something else, apply it, look at it from a different lens. So whether you're just starting out, you've been doing this 100 years, there is a lot of information to be had at this particular talk today. So welcome, Spencer. Thanks for coming over.
Hey, thanks for having me here, Stormie. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and it was so funny before we were talking about our beverage stations that we've got
Hmm.
going, and Spencer has a Tibetan crystal in there.
Yeah,
So
Tibetan quartz.
Tibetan quartz. So obviously it's gonna be supercharged today because you have Tibetan quartz running through your system.
Hopefully that I'll be able to channel something good.
Okay, awesome. All right, guys. So this week is a busy week on the Eat and Greets. We've got Spencer happening today. We had Robert. We've had Arland here. Felina will be here tomorrow to talk about Chiron. So it is a busy week. So buckle in. There's a lot to learn. And if you have to miss, no worries. You can catch it on the replays. They stay up on the YouTube channel as well. So let's jump in. Let's get into this thing today, man. Spencer, you're not just visiting us. You've got some other field trips coming up as well. Where are you going to be?
Yeah, I'll be doing a talk at the Great Lakes Astrology Conference, which I believe is taking place the July 9th through the 13th. I'm going to be giving a talk on the decans and the tarot and how it relates to the houses of the Thema Mundi. So that'll be an online conference that you can find at greatlakesastrology.com. I also do readings and a weekly forecast at my YouTube channel, Spencer Michaud Astrology. And I'm on Facebook and Instagram too, at Spencer Michaud. So you can find me on all those different social media channels. And I'm just kind of trying to keep up with all the happenings and the aspects and do my best to provide some sort of guidance or interpretations for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you guys, as always, I will make sure that the links are in the description box down below. So, if you want to check out the conference, maybe this is your first conference, go check it out. Go see everybody who's over there. Gary Caton's over there as well, and he's been here. So, I think it'll be a good time. Plus, if you like podcasting, I've had a chance to listen to Spencer's podcast, and the content is great, but his microphone is like fabulous. It is seriously like the butter of microphones. So,
It's a Shure SM7B, if you're wondering, which is the same microphone that Michael Jackson used to record on Thriller. So little
so
fun fact.
between the microphone and the Tibetan quartz, you're pretty much good to go in life, Spencer.
I'm ready to go.
Awesome. Okay, you guys. So today we're going to talk about the planets. And first, we're going to do a little bit of talking about the 7 visible planets, and then we'll bring in the other planets at the end. And I know Spencer's got some good slides for us and good content. So, Spencer, I'm going to head to the chat box and see what's going on there if you want to jump us in
Cool.
here.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen here because I think there's a few things I'd like to show everyone as we get started. And so first of all, let's see what we got here. Can you all see that? Is that coming
Yes.
through? Okay. So what we're looking at here is what is called the Ptolemaic Model or the celestial spheres model. And in the type of astrology that I study, so the past few years I've been kind of transitioning from a more modern psychological approach and learning more about the astrology's ancient roots and studying Hellenistic astrology with my teacher Achyuta Bhava, formerly known as Adam Ellenbos, through his great Nightlight astrology courses, and through other authors such as Chris Brennan, Demetra George, Ben Dykes. Robert Schmidt's work at Project Hindsight was very influential. So this is where some of these concepts I've been drawing from are coming from. And in the ancient Hellenistic model, they thought of, it was, first thing we have to understand about the way that they practice astrology is that it was geocentric. So in this model here, we have the Earth in the center of that universe. And there's a lot of people that are like, well, we know now that the Earth revolves around the sun and things of that nature. Well, when we're working with this system, the system is based on the way that we are observing the heavens or the stars from our position on the earth. And a lot of our astrology is going to be based on the symbolic representation of what we see in the sky and how we make sense of it. So in this particular case, we're seeing the earth is in the middle. And they thought that the earth was surrounded by these different planetary spheres that were constantly in motion. Okay, so we've got the sphere of the elements that was directly surrounding the earth, and those elements were like fire, water, air, earth. They had qualities that were hot and dry and cold and wet, and those were one of the ways that we described the planets. And then the planetary spheres that surround the earth are based on the apparent speed of those planets as they move around the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is the path of the path of the sun as it relates to the earth, or the earth relating to the sun. One of those two, one of those two things. So the first sphere that we have here. Now, let me back up a second. We have the planetary spheres, but we also have the spheres of the fixed stars. So one of the things we have to talk about before we talk about planets is the word in Greek for planet meant wandering star. So the planets were celestial bodies that were moving in relationship to the fixed stars that were relatively stationary and rose in the same position in relationship to each other. And these ancients noticed that these particular stars that we consider the planets were moving and in relationship to those constellations. So that's one thing to really understand is when we talk about planets, we're talking about wandering stars. So they thought of this outermost ring as the most divine. The fixed stars was like the heavens that were outside of the planetary spheres. And as we go down, we have the slowest moving planets represented by Saturn. This is also called the Chaldean order of the planets. So they did a lot of their significations based on the relative speed of the planets, the way that they appeared through color, and of course through some of the mythology that we draw upon as well. So Saturn was the outermost sphere, and then it comes down into Jupiter, Mars, and then the sun, which is in the center, Venus, Mercury, and the moon. Now, the planets that are above the sphere of the sun are called the superior planets, which are Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. And the ones that are below or inside the orbit here are Venus, Mercury, and the moon. So I wanted to get that out of the way first, that this is one of the main ways that we think about the planets in ancient astrology as rotating spheres that are moving around the Earth. Okay. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's important to point out too. If you're just starting to study and your eyes are like, wait, what's happening? This is not what I learned from, whatever.com. That's okay. This is a specific kind of astrology. This is looking at ancient astrology versus some of the modern concepts that we have. So the chart may look like it completely like diverges from what you've seen, but this is in astrology, we have specifics, we have specific niches, we have specific branches that study things a certain way. So as you're listening today, just kind of wrap your head around that concept.
Yeah. So I'm going to share a different photo here because another way that we think about the planets is through what is called the Thema Mundi. Yeah. And the Thema Mundi is hold on a second. Let me get my. Okay, so here we go. So the Thema Mundi was what the ancients believed was the natal chart of the world. And they placed the 7 visible planets in particular houses and gave them stewardship of each of those houses. And so we can see that we have the moon here on the ascendant. The ascendant in the Thema Mundi was Cancer. And I believe that they thought that they had associations with a particular star that rose around the solstice, which was, I believe, Sirius, which is near the sign of Cancer, which brought the floods to the Nile. So they considered that a place of birth and the birth of the cosmos. And then they flanked out the planets in order of speed and assigned them to a domicile. So you can see here we've got the two lights, the two luminaries, the sun and the moon, and I'll talk about that and define that term. Then we have Mercury flanking out here in both Virgo and in Gemini. So you can see that here. That would be where Mercury is. And then we have Venus flanking out to Libra and Taurus, and Mars to Scorpio and Aries, Jupiter to Sagittarius and Pisces, and Saturn with Capricorn and Aquarius. Now, a lot of the significations that we have, especially for our aspects in astrology, come from these positions in the Thema Mundi. So we have significations with Venus being a planet that aspects or is able to see both of the lights, and that was a harmonious relationship. Here we have Mars being related to the square aspect and Saturn being related to an opposition aspect. And a lot of the significations that we have of the planets are based on the interplay of lightness and darkness, and of an agricultural model of life-giving and of life taking away, of death, of the kind of experience of things that are conducive to supporting life and things that take away from it. So that's another fundamental concept that I thought was important to share before we dive right into it. Okay.
Your digital drawings were life, by the way.
What's that?
Your digital drawings were completely life.
Yeah, it's hard to draw with a mouse. Yes. You know, like it's a constant challenge when I'm doing my forecast too. It's like, how can I share this and not look like I'm in, preschool? Drawing these. Okay, so here's one more way we can think of the planets and how we derive meaning from them in the ancient system, and that is the planetary joys. So the ancients thought that the planets had a position in the particular natal chart where a particular house where they had where they really were able to do their best because they had a connection with the significations of that house. And we can see here that Mercury joys in the first, Saturn in the 12th, Jupiter in the 11th house, the sun in the 9th opposing the moon in the 3rd, and Venus in the 5th, along with the 6th house being Mars. So let me collect my thoughts on that.
Well, I can tell you, I'm a 9th house sun. So
yeah. Well, if we're going to come back to this, but I wanted to just introduce that thought because I want to come back to this after we introduce each of the planets, because I think it'll give an extra layer of depth on what they mean and what they're trying to do in our life. Okay. So I have another little thing here. Sorry, I've got a lot of different things that I'm sharing.
No, that's beautiful. People in the comment section are loving it. So
okay, cool.
Share away.
Okay. So I've got another thing here, and I won't have to skip around as much with this. Can you all see that?
Yes.
I'm going to go full screen with that. All right. So thoughts to ponder. And this is a quote from Robert Schmidt, who was one of the founders of Project Hindsight. He was a very intelligent man who really understood a lot about the Greek language and knew a lot about the Greek history and had a lot of interesting thoughts about how the relationships of the planets were working out. And he says, the ancient Greeks thought of the planets as emissaries or omens of the gods, forming a city-like community. Each planet played out a specific role in relationship to one another and gave witness and testimony on the fate of a mortal. So, and this is a concept that I'm still learning more about myself. But the ancient philosophers and astrologers thought of the planets being in this kind of like cosmic courtroom that were giving And this witness and testimony type of concept talks about, like, we have like people on the witness stand, and we have lawyers that are questioning them, and then we have judges that are making judgments and talking about what a person might experience here on earth. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes in astrological circles about fate versus free will. And a lot of people have an aversion. I know I did when I first started studying ancient astrology, because it seemed like it was a little bit more fatalistic, and like it was more about like, this is what's going to happen. And in my as I've learned more about how they really thought about fate, is they had different types of fate. And they had something called hemermene, which was some like kind of the conditions that you were born into that may be less changeable, maybe events that play out in your life. They had this thing called a non-K, which was some of the fate that was experienced through our ignorance, through not knowing any better, through darkness. And then they had a type of fate called pronoia, which is very similar to the religious concept of providence, which is the fate that we create through our intelligence and through our foreknowledge and through our knowing and through our grace. So thinking about it in those three different ways was very interesting to me. And there's also a way that we can think about the planets as different ways that we can think about them as qualitative versus quantitative. And there was a shift from the planets being deities and the world being ensouled. And this shift came when we had Copernicus basically like blew everybody's minds and said, you know what, the Earth is not the center of the universe. We revolve around this thing called the sun. And then it started this kind of scientific, revolution. And it really led to a lot more rational, quantitative thinking rather than qualitative thinking. And we saw this play out with a Aristotelian way of thinking about the universe too. We have this kind of shift with Plato and Aristotle. And Plato thought of the planets as these omens of a deity. So they were representative. They weren't necessarily creating or creating the things on Earth. They were just signposts. They were guides. And when we get to Aristotle, he was starting to get more of this vibe of, oh, the planets are sending out these rays or these kind of like magnetic fields type of experience, and they are creating what is happening on the Earth. So it's interesting to think about the dichotomy between those two different ways of thinking about the planets first. So I think that's a good introduction here. Another way that Schmidt thought about the planets was that each planet had an essential nature and had an abstract nature, so an essence. And he put he was saying that the planet's essence took form through the condition of a sign. Okay, so the sign could be thought of as a birth channel for the essential nature of the planet. And he made this comparison to our thoughts being the essential natures, being formed into audible words that are speaking to us. And he makes a lot of points about the planets being omens that are speaking, and astrology being divinatory in nature. We are, as astrologers, we are diviners. We are making interpretations as to what may happen, or what types of even what types of thoughts and feelings we may have as human beings, and what types of tendencies we may have based on those planetary positions, and that is divination. So I thought that was really brilliant, the way that he talks about this. He describes this as pneuma, or breath. So a lot of the significations of the planets comes from kind of the breath of divinity speaking into those audible, concrete forms and words.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Okay. Pretty neat, huh? And so he had all of these essential natures for these planets. And this is what we've got here. So we start out with the luminaries. And the luminaries is a fancy word for the sun and the moon. And in ancient astrology, the sun and the moon, and I think in modern astrology as well, the sun and the moon took great precedence in when we're trying to analyze a chart and think about the significations of our astrological profile. And they have an interesting way of thinking about each of them. Now, one interesting visible type of phenomenon is that the sun and the moon appear to be the same size in the sky, even though the sun is millions of times bigger, right? They appear equal in size, which I thought is really fascinating. And that's one of the reasons we have something like a eclipse phenomenon, that the light of the moon and the size of the earth can actually block out the light. And light is one of the most important qualities of these luminaries. Luminary means to bring light, right? So the sun was thought of as the celestial king, the celestial light of the mind, the awareness of the soul. And it had various names in different cultures. I believe the Babylonians called it Shamesh. It was called Helios in the Greek systems, Apollo, Sol, Surya in the Indian system. And each of these planets has a poetic name as well. And the poetic name gives us some insight into that, the meaning. And the poetic name of the sun was called Phos, which means light. So we can think of it as the light of the mind, divinity. One of the things that we can think about with the sun is that the sun is basically related to primary motion in the zodiac. So there's two types of motion that we draw significations from. And I don't want to get my, I don't want to mess up my thing here, but imagine this moon here is a natal chart, okay? And we've got our horizon over here. And hold on a second, you're gonna like my my drawings.
Okay, I'm like, I feel like we're getting ready to get good here.
Okay, so imagine we've got a horizon line, and even though this isn't necessarily the horizon, but primary motion. Now, this is not an accurate depiction of the moon and the sun because we wouldn't see this in the sky. Okay, they wouldn't look like this together because the light of the sun would be, if they were that close together, they'd be blocking each other out here, or the sun would be blocking out that moon's light. But imagine we have the sun that rises in the east and makes this path, okay, and it culminates in the south at the top of the sky here, and then it makes this path and it sets in the west, and then eventually it goes underneath the horizon and comes back again. Now this is a clockwise motion that's called primary motion, and we can see this in the chart. If we were to step our natal charts through time, we would see that the planets would rise up to the center of our chart at the top, and then fall again and set in the west, in the seventh house. They would rise in the first house, the ascendant, and they would set in the west, the descendant. Okay, so that motion is called primary motion, and it's related to the sun, and it's said to be of the it was said to be something of consistency and the realm of divinity. This was the planet, quote unquote, even though we know it's a star, that was most associated with God and divinity and what is unchanging. Okay, like our eternal soul, and you can see that in its symbol too. We have a kind of a central quality, and it's unchanging, right? The center. So the sun is the center, and it's also the center of that celestial sphere model that I was showing you. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of my Sesame Street.
Get rid of your brilliant drawing.
Right?
Well, and we see the sun in his poetic name. We see that as we cross into science as well, and we see phosphorus, which is the light bringer, and we like that because we like some light bulbs. So
absolutely,
we get to kind of bring these into a practical reality and see even where these names touch our everyday lives in what it is that they do.
Yeah, and I find this more and more as I'm going through just understanding some of the ancient terminology and nomenclature. Is these words are really ingrained in our language and how we describe things, and they're coming from this very ancient place. And I think that's a wonderful observation, because it's just kind of already infused into our understanding of our reality. Like light, it permeates everything.
Yeah.
So the abstract concept behind the sun is this concept of majesty, of divinity, of masculine authority. And we don't necessarily have to think about that as gendered authority, but this concept of being very active, the quality of masculinity being an active quality that is yang, a yang quality. And sometimes when they thought that this would concretize into form through the king, through the father, through a priest, and Schmidt and assigned these kind of essential wills that the planets were trying to manifest through specific signs. And the sun's will was to command, and it had the quality of selection. So when we think of the sun, we are selecting our identity. We're saying this is who we are. And I'm going to say, this is how I'm going to, this is the awareness I have of my higher self and of my soul. And that is how I'm going to think of myself in a lot of ways. Okay. And of course, the sun is the host of the sign or the temple of Leo. So they thought of the signs as temples that were kind of these abodes of the gods, of the celestial planets. Okay. And so that's interesting, because when we get to Saturn, we have a contrary nature to Saturn, because Saturn is darkness. Saturn is the exclusion of light, the absence of light. So Saturn may be a planet or an experience where we're feeling like we're exiled, or where we have a lack of awareness, particularly. Okay, so I'm going to move forward to the moon here. Let's see if I can, oops, move my chart.
And
Okay.
just in case you guys were wondering, I'll make sure that this is in the description box as well. But when we're referring to Project Hindsight, this is actually something that happened in the 90s, and they were going back and like translating and interpreting texts from, gosh, they're really, really old, obviously, right?
Yeah.
From ancient.
I believe the, oh man, history is not my strongest suit, but I believe it's the 3rd century before Common Era. I could be incorrect. It could be after the Common Era, but I believe it's the 3rd century BCE. That we're going back at least 2,000 years here. You know, that's what we're experiencing. There was kind of one interesting like digression is that astrology was fairly unchanged for about 1,500 years. Yes, there were some shifts in people's awareness, but we went through this kind of dark age around the 15, 16, 1700s, where we lost touch with a lot of that material. And astrology was basically rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century through the Theosophists and through people like Alan Leo, who were kind of recreating this system. And they didn't have access to a lot of this material, because a lot of it had kind of gone underground, because a lot of astrologers started to become persecuted for their beliefs. And there was a lot of power from organized religion that really wanted to suppress a lot of this knowledge. And if you were an astrologer, you could be considered a heretic and be put to death. So a lot of the information went underground. But it's interesting, because a lot of what we are doing in modern astrology is coming from a recreation that was kind of working with half of a deck, you know. Sure. And I don't think that going back and understanding the ancient astrology has to negate all of what we are using as modern astrologers. I think it's adding to it. It's adding depth to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you even think about, as ancient astrologers, much more we're looking at concrete events through a chart rather than someone's psychology. But I think that the way that I've reconciled the two, and it took a while, like I've been studying Hellenistic astrology for about 3 years now. And I really had an existential crisis about it in the beginning, because I was like, oh my God, are a lot of these events that I'm experiencing much more faded? And what does that mean? And the way I reconciled kind of the psychological approach with more like concrete approach is that we do experience events that I think that sometimes we don't have complete control over. But that does create think about it like this. We have cause and effect, and we make judgments based on the experiences that we have. And we have belief systems that we craft internally that guide our life, that are narratives that guide our actions based on some of the things that we've experienced in our life as well. And so I think that they fuse. They are definitely, there's a combination of both kind of factors, right? Because if, let's say you have a different experience when you're a child, that may lead to you making a different choice when presented with a similar challenge as somebody else, you know?
Sure.
And I think that that's something that if we recognize that, because I don't think we are, I used to be very much, and you all are free to disagree with me, but I used to be very much in the mindset of we create our own reality. And very much like creative visualization, um, and I've since abandoned some of that thinking, not completely,
Sure.
but I don't necessarily believe that if I just think positively enough, I'm going to completely restructure my
Mhm.
life, because that has not been my experience. That has not been my lived experience. And I think what it does is it takes the focus off of feeling guilty that we aren't pure enough of mind, and realize that sometimes difficult, challenging things happen to us as human beings that aren't necessarily our fault.
Mhm.
And I really like that approach too. And that brings a lot more grace, I think, to my experience of astrology, because then we're not blaming the victim for not being mentally disciplined enough to, you know, if we only had not thought about this bad feeling, we
Right.
wouldn't have experienced this bad thing, you know?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think that's been really a big change in how I've looked at astrology.
Yeah. And there's something to, on my side in my lived experience as well, aging with astrology that also then, putting together the ancient ideas or perspectives from just where this came from in the first place, and then how it fused into the modern, that too reshaped a lot of what I thought as well, because
Yeah.
my lived experience is not that you can create a vision board on Friday and not do absolutely anything and it's going to work out. Like,
Right.
that is not my experience. And my experience is that we have guilt, we have shame, we have blame, we have all of these things that humans come with.
Yeah.
But the chart as a pathway to kind of know where your default blame button is at is really useful,
Sure.
because then there are some brilliant actions that can be taken to help you move through the reality
I
differently. But
agree.
it's this brilliant combination in astrology, more and more, I feel like, that is, it's like a beautiful map that also opens up the door to accountability in the right
Yeah.
form.
I love that. I love that word, accountability, because, you know, like, because as I've gone through uh, becoming more Saturnian, you know, like,
Yeah.
there is definitely a taking responsibility for our actions as well. And we'll get to that when we get to Saturn too, because accountability and punitive redemptive justice through Saturn, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the moon?
Yes, let's do, because we can be on a whole
We'll be
nother,
on
we're
all
gonna be
day.
a whole nother episode in a
No,
minute.
this is great. I love it. You're doing a great thing here, Stormy. Um, so the moon, aka Luna, Selene, it was also called Sin, which I thought was very interesting, and
Mhm.
Chandra in the Indian or Vedic or Jyotisha system. So if we think about the sun as unchanging divinity based on primary motion, that clockwise motion of the planets across the sky, the moon is more associated with the realm of form and of fortune. And it was the celestial sphere that was closest to the earth. And I've heard another favorite astrologer I have, Austin Coppock, talk about the lunar sphere as sort of like this membrane, this womb that surrounds the earth, that is letting form manifest and come in, and also allowing it to pass out. It like decides what comes in and what goes out. And the moon was thought of as a measure of time as well. So whenever I look at a chart, I'm looking at the moon, since it is the fastest moving body that we observe, as triggering these different, it's like I've compared it to a music box cylinder. So if you think about a music box cylinder, you have these tuned keys, and the cylinder has these little spikes on it that when it rotates, it strikes those keys, and we get that music from it. And the moon is sort of that rotating cylinder that at various points is striking the different notes to give us an experience and to say that it is time for this. That's what astrology is. It's a giant clock. It
Yeah.
is telling us the quality of time.
Hmm.
And that's time is not this flat vacuumous space. Time has like it has texture, and
Yeah.
I think that's something that has really helped me understand astrology as well.
Yeah, and you think in the moon cycle, in the 28-day cycle that we see as it comes in and strums each of those vibrational little moments, it's like, hey, it is time to get organized today. It is
That's
time to
right.
feel this. It is time to, like we get all of that in a month.
Yes.
So when people are like, I'm so bored, I'm like, how? How
Yeah.
you're having such a busy moon experience. How are you bored?
Yeah. Well, and like you were saying too about having some foreknowledge of our charts can help us make better choices. I think it just brings us in alignment with, I like studying Taoism, the Tao, I consider the Tao just the rhythms of nature. And
Yeah.
really that's what the moon is it's talking about too, is we have this very visible rhythm. And what we have times where we're trying to bring things into manifestation when the moon is waxing, when it's gaining in light, when it is collecting things, it's collecting light. And then we have times where we're disseminating that out into the world, and we're kind of trying to process it. And we have forms that grow and forms that decay. So understanding the moon as having those dual qualities is really important, as far as like bringing forms into being and then allowing them to pass out of being as well. Okay.
Yeah.
um, the the poetic name was Selene, which meant bright or flashing flame. And the ancients considered the moon the goddess of wisdom, the measure of time. It had a reflecting quality because it reflected the solar light. It was associated with life, the body, and conception. And we can see that with its correlation with the Cancer having being the house on the ascendant of the Thema Mundi. So we have the conception and the union of the body and the soul when they come together at the ascendant. So we have birth associations with that. In concrete forms, we have concrete when the moon manifests into form. We see themes of the queen, the mother, the nurse, the feminine quality. It was also associated with voyages and travel since it moves very quickly. There was even some uh, ancient authors in the Egyptian system that associated the moon with Thoth, which was the god of writing, the scribe. And we can see this. I think this is interesting because the moon has its joy in the third house of communication. Okay, and the third house of, we can see that as writing and communicating, and the goddess. So they called that house the goddess. Schmidt thought of the will of the moon as being a quality of inclusion, where it is collecting things in and saying, you are included, not just selecting, not saying I am. This is like, we are all part
Mhm.
of this. So they have it's associations with the moon as being part of the public and the masses,
Yeah.
and collecting all of these different energies. And when we're looking at a chart too, when we see the moon contacting different planets, it is collecting the light from that planet and kind of transmitting it out in the particular area of the chart. The moon also nourishes. It is a manifester, and it rules or hosts the sign of Cancer. Um, so one other way we can think of the moon, and I think this is important too, if I was to show you again this concept of having the horizon here, right? And I'm going to make it my little drawings again. So the realm of fortune was the moon's realm. And that was, if are you familiar with the tarot card, the Wheel of Fortune?
Uh-huh.
So we can think of that as, I think, a very lunar card as well, where we're seeing the spinning and the coming into being of a life. We are born, and we grow to manifestation, and then we recede into old age and pass out of being. And that was associated with the moon. And that was also associated with secondary motion. So they have this way of the chart moving in secondary motion where we see the planets moving in a counterclockwise fashion. Okay. And that was associated with how the planets move. So the planets are trying to bring forms in and out of being as well and assert their own wills. And there's these two contrasting yin and yang types of motions that we have to understand with the planets. So the when we think of the sun, we can think of the sun more as being related to a concept called spirit or daimon, because they call the houses of the sun, the top half of the chart, and the 11th and the 12th house in particular, the houses of good or bad daimon. And the ancient Greeks thought of good and bad a little bit differently than we think of it now. They didn't really think of it as moralistically. There was a lot more gray area in their moral structure, and it was more about conducive to life or antithesis to life.
Sure.
And we have the fifth and the sixth house being associated with the realm of fortune, and they called that 2K, which was the more randomized distributions of fate. So I would be remiss to continue without talking about the concept of sect that the ancients believed in. So the ancients said that each of these two luminaries was responsible for a team of planets, or basically they had, think of it like, and this is not a great example because of how polarized it is right now, but think about like the political parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And we have in our political system, we have a political party that is generally has a majority and has a little bit more agency to pass the types of laws that they want to pass. And when we have a team of planets that is in power, they are either of the day sect or the diurnal sect or the nocturnal sect. And each of those has a luminary that is its ruler. So the sun rules the day and the moon rules the night. And on the sun's team, we've got Saturn.
On the sun's team,
Jupiter and the sun. On the moon, we have Venus and Mars. And then Mercury is said to be common.
Mercury goes between the worlds as he's been doing
Exactly.
in all stories.
Yeah. So we have these teams, right? And Mercury, when we talk about Mercury, he definitely goes between worlds. He's the psychopomp, which was the deliverer of messages, or the messenger, the deliverer of souls to the underworld, and back from the underworld. So when we see that we have so you can even look at this in your own chart and say, well, am I a day or a night birth? And that's based on, was the sun above or below the horizon when you were born? So if the sun was above the horizon when you were born, you have a day sect chart. If it was below the horizon, you have a night sect chart. And these planets right here, if you are a night birth, will have a little bit more political power. And these planets right here will have a little bit more political power in your chart if they are of the day sect. Now, the interesting thing is that it doesn't mean that we can't manifest some of the significations of the out of sect planets. It just means that they may have to make more compromises. Just like a political party that is out of power has to kind of, they may not get everything they want in the bill that they're trying to pass. They may have to like take some things out and cross off a few things and make compromises because they can't just pass it with their own, their own willpower, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And are you on the day or the night team?
I'm a day birth. But my chart is sort of interesting because I have I'm a 12th house Cancer sun. So it's ruled by the moon, and my moon is in Taurus at the very top of the chart, like very close to the midheaven. And so I'm a Leo ascendant. So I have kind of the solar quality, but yet the lunar qualities are very visible. So I have found that I have I don't know, it's a real mixed bag. with me. I feel like I embody a lot of the lunar archetypes, but maybe I guess in a solar way. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. I get that. I'm a day chart too.
Your day
Yeah.
chart
Yeah,
and
I'm sun in the ninth, but
nice.
my, all the rest of my team members are below.
Yeah, yeah. And that makes it a compromise, right? Like some of those team members, even just with their position in the nocturnal part of the chart, can change their condition. So
Yeah.
what we look at in ancient astrology is the condition of a planet. Is it in a temple where it is being provided for with resources that are allow it to do what it wants to do? So, like for example, the moon is the steward of the temple of Cancer. So wherever Cancer falls in your chart, we're looking at the moon to provide resources for that area of your life. So Stormie, where is Cancer in your chart? What house
The 11th
number?
house.
Okay, so and where is your moon placed?
It is comfortably in the second house in Libra.
Okay, so your Libra moon in the second provides resources for that 11th house of groups, of hopes, of wishes, of like people that you have a shared sense of purpose with. And it is because of its condition in Libra, it provides those types of qualities of grace, of wanting to be a peacemaker, of wanting to be someone who is, you know, manifesting the qualities of fairness and of justice, and that is informing how you will, you know, interact with the group. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I
See me
love
in
this.
action.
Yeah, you're doing it right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, so let's move forward.
Yeah, and just a little feedback here is that
Yeah.
this is going very well according to
Okay.
the chat. So they're in.
Good.
We're in, guys.
You're with me. You're with me.
Yes.
You're feeling me. Okay, good. Yeah. I have a lot of Virgo planets too in my chart. I have 3 planets in Virgo. So I try to be as detailed as I can. So if I'm Virgoing out, you can, but I try to make it practical. I want to bring it all back to something grounded and practical as well, because I do think that that's important. Is we can get really fixated, I think, sometimes on technique, but we have to really make it usable. And I think that that's kind of the Virgo way is we have all these ideas, but how do we use them? How do we apply them in our life?
Yes. Well, you're just fine with my Virgo rising. So let's
Okay,
taking
good.
practicality on.
All right. So let's talk about I'm going to give you the good news first, right? We'll talk about the benefics first. And I guess I don't want to make it good news, bad news, because like I said, the Greeks did not necessarily think of it as morally good and bad. They thought of it more as functionally good and bad.
Sure.
Okay. So when we talk about the benefics were the 2 planets, Jupiter and Venus, that were uh, helping to bring form into being and were nurturing life. So they thought of these both planets as having these Aristotelian qualities of warmth and wetness. And if you have ever tried to grow plants, plants need heat and plants need water to grow, right? We can also take those to extremes too. If we have too much warmth and wetness, we can grow mold. So there definitely is too much of a good thing as well. But Jupiter was also known as Jove. He was called Zeus in the Greek system. In the Babylonian astrological system, he was called Marduk, and Brishapat in the Jyotisha system. And one thing is very interesting is that both of these deities, Zeus and Marduk, battled a dragon to bring order back to the cosmos. So I think that there is some really interesting mythological themes with Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is called the greater benefic, and that is because it is the superior planet, where it is outside of the orbit or the celestial sphere. It is superior to the celestial sphere of the sun. It is above it, okay, where we call Venus the lesser benefic because its celestial sphere is below the sun. And Jupiter, his poetic name was called Phaethon, or the radiant one. Jupiter is a planet that establishes order and organization in the cosmos. It is the guardian of justice and law. It was the begetter of children. If you do any astrology, or I'm sorry, mythology, you'll know that Jupiter was or Zeus was a pretty lusty dude. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, he
He
had a
liked a
wife.
little bit of everything. He's
He
like
did.
nymph, human, whatever. I'm down for whatever.
Yeah, he had a wife, but he was not faithful. He was like, I'm going to turn into a swan. I'm going to mate with this. I'm going to mate. Yeah, exactly. So he was, he had many, many children in the Greek mythological system. So we can also think about him associated with erotic love too, alliances, knowledge, abundance, mediation of disputes. Like the Jupiter was the cosmic judge who is trying to take all the disparate elements and bring them into some kind of unified whole. And we can see astrological opposites in the ancient system. And in general, we can think of Mercury and Jupiter being astrological opposites, because Mercury is the cosmic lawyer who is creating this destabilization and questioning things and separating things out into categories, whereas Jupiter is trying to bring all those things that were, have separated out into a cohesive whole. So if you think about what happens in a courtroom, you have the lawyers that are trying to cast doubt in the minds of a jury or in the judge, and they're trying to argue for their case. They have all this evidence that they're presenting that are, very, very in form. Whereas, and eventually, Jupiter or Zeus, the cosmic judge, has to say, well, I've taken all these opinions into account, and this is my final judgment. This is how I'm bringing order and justice to this particular case. And that's the similar thing that we see with Jupiter in our charts too. Jupiter is also where we have a gift. This is something where something may come easier to us, where we may have a quality where we are, we are able to teach that quality. Jupiter was associated with sages and with teachers. And Schmidt talked about its essence, its will is to stabilize and to affirm and confirm and to bring things as like a bridge together. And it hosts and rules both the signs of Sagittarius and Pisces, and both of those can be thought of as bridges. Sagittarius was a bridge between our animal nature and our human qualities, because it was the centaur, half horse and half human, and they're fused together. Do you see that? Whereas Pisces is like the bridge between the spiritual world and the physical world, where we're going off into the wilderness of our minds and of our souls, and trying to bring something back into being. That's associated with the seasons of the winter, where we are trying to bring things together to prepare for the return of the dominance of the light. Okay, so Jupiter rules the sign of Sagittarius, which is the one that is directly before the winter solstice, where we start to gain in light again. So we have not just this agricultural theme, but this quality of light and darkness. Whereas Pisces is sort of this quality where we are preparing for the days to start to become longer than the nighttime again at the spring equinox. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
And you could see that too with Mercury too. I was having this conversation with my astrology teacher, Achyuta Bhavadas, who we've had a lot of good philosophical conversations about this. And I want to give him some credit with this thought as well. Is we were talking about Mercury and Jupiter in this way. And you can think about Mercury as being the destabilization process that happens before the sun starts to lose light, where, how Gemini is the sign right before the summer solstice, when the days start to become shorter. And Mercury, it also rules the sign of Virgo, where we have a destabilization process where we have the end of summer, and then at the fall equinox, the night starts to become greater in length. So we have these, and they're both cadent, mutable signs, which represent change. Mm-hmm. So I think both Jupiter and Mercury can represent change as well. And I want to think about them in that regard also. The condition of Jupiter, we're seeing this as a collective right now as well. because we have a very mercurial dominant type of experience right now, Mercury dominant experience. As the nodes of the moon moved from into Gemini, the north node of the moon in Gemini, which is hosted by Mercury, and the south node hosted by Jupiter, we see at the nodes of the moon energy coming in and energy passing out of being. It's related to that moon. Remember that membrane that allows things. And uh, we do have some cliched thinking when we talk about portals in astrology, right? But if you really do want to have portal type thinking, the nodes and the eclipses are the most portal like of qualities, where energy, where there really is a doorway that is opening for things to come in and things to come out, right?
Yeah, and we've got a good portal coming up at the
Oh my
solstice
God,
here.
we're in the middle of a huge
Yeah.
huge opening right now.
Brilliant. And it's just right there with that node. So just so delicious.
Yes. And so we can think of the energy that is coming in as mercurial right now, where we're being asked to live with our uncertainty and ask questions. And we're being asked to compost and release Jupiter type things right now, which is old belief systems
Yes.
and old hierarchical structures that we've been living with for some time. Like you can see this in our collective right now as we are trying to dismantle the old order that is no longer serving us as a community and as a human, species. And the interesting thing about this is Jupiter right now is in Saturn's house, and said to be in its fall, and it's at the bottom of the wheel of fortune. So Jupiter is in an earth sign, in being provided for by Saturn, which is associated with death, constriction, and contraction. And we're seeing the death and contraction and the composting and the redemption of some of our old belief systems so that we can build something in the future that is more representative of truth, of divine truth, rather than this earthly truth that we have tried to manifest. Because a lot of times we can think of what we're trying to manifest on earth as a poor copy of that divine truth that we may be trying to get in touch with. And we can see this right now. When we have Jupiter in poor condition, we're going to be made aware of the flaws in our system of order. And that's important because anytime we have, if you think about it agriculturally, we cannot have periods of unchecked growth that is eternal. We cannot just try to grow things in the soil, right, Stormie?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. It's cyclical. And we have to have periods of contraction that allow for nutrients to replenish the soil so we can grow something healthy in the future. And that's why I can see beauty in this Jupiter in its fall condition, because the beauty, there's beauty in contraction, there's beauty in decay, there's beauty in death. As a Western culture, we have this huge aversion to death. And we have this huge aversion to failure and to anything that is seen as loss. And that has gotten us to a place of unchecked growth where what we are growing is corrupted. It is not, I mean, think about trying to grow a plant in soil that has been completely tapped of any resources. What you grow doesn't have any nutrients and vitamins anymore.
Yeah.
Because we didn't allow the cycle.
And that's interesting to think about in terms of just the science of the cycle. The moon's poetic name is Selene, and selenium, we find it in the soil, and we only need a small amount of it in cycle in order for it to help everything grow. And so if we don't have that, people whose bodies lack selenium, who lack enough of the cycle and of that particular mineral, have these autoimmune issues that come up, right? Have these infertility issues that come up. And we can see that based along the lines of our society as well, just by following the planets. And that Jupiter placement, even in fall, he's too wise to not see and point out the wisdom of old knowledge we have that is still useful, as well as old knowledge that we have that doesn't work. But I love that in his fall here, he's got some travel buddies to help
Yeah.
things die off and to help the eye of wisdom become big, right?
He's
'Cause
got some crazy buddies
he's
right now.
got some
He's
crazy buddies. I know.
got,
What is it? Who is it? Is it
he's got Pluto magnifying everything and making it into a nuclear, basically a nuclear
oh
bomb
yeah,
of change. Okay.
absolutely.
And
Oh wow.
Saturn has been traveling with Jupiter as well, saying, okay, I'm going to give you the discipline necessary to
Yeah.
really make that change and to work within limitation and
Yeah.
work within the structures and recreate those new structures.
We've got to have that combination of the tribe, I think, to make it work. Because Saturn's like, it's time to go to the next level. Jupiter's like, I'll show you the wisdom of what works and what doesn't. And Pluto's like, let's die off because we've got to live in a different way. So, I mean, and really, Pluto is what Saturn's only real friend. So, it's really nice when they travel together and then Jupiter's able to bring in some wisdom. So, oh my God, see, like we already have like 3 other podcast episodes available
Yes,
right now.
That's true. That's true. Now, don't get me wrong, and we'll touch on Pluto a little bit more. We think about Pluto as transformation, right? That's kind of the buzzword for it, but it's not always. We're not always going to think of the end result of the transformation with Pluto. We have to think of the process.
Yeah.
And we have this metaphor, this cocoon metaphor, right, where the caterpillar is completely dissolving its former being and turning into this soup and restructuring its DNA basically to be this completely different thing. And we're in the cocoon right now, dissolving those old forms and ready to emerge. But it can feel painful. It's confusing.
Sure.
We don't know. The caterpillar doesn't know what the heck it's going to be after it changes. And we have that fear of the unknown that is natural. And we also have the constriction of the cocoon that feels very painful. And it takes a Herculean effort to bust out of it as well. So we're seeing that also with Pluto. So it is definitely, we have to acknowledge that pain that comes along with the change too.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I've been really, I'm trying to make sure that I acknowledge the darkness too, because I really think that is part of the way that we create balance. I think when you were talking about sickness, when we have an illness or a dis-ease, right, a disease, we're out of balance. And they thought about this in medieval astrology and medieval medicine, was we had different qualities that were out of balance. I believe you just had a medical astrologer that was on your show as
Robert.
well. Yeah, and you could see that these different humors were out of balance, and that's what creates the sickness. So it's all about bringing things back into wholeness again.
Yeah.
All right, what do you say we talk about Venus?
Yeah, let's go. And look, we have another phosphorus, another fire. Yay.
Okay, so Venus is the lesser benefic. It is of the night sect. And it was called Aphrodite in the Greek system, Shukra in Jyotisha, and Ishtar in the Babylonian system. And Phosphorus is the Greek poetic name, the torchbearer, which also has associations with light or with glowing. It was the goddess of love as the evening star, but the goddess of war as the morning star.
Yes.
Which I think is something that we don't see in astrology a lot. And that's about the relationship of the planet to the sun. Does it rise before the planet? Okay, does it rise before the sun? Okay, if I'm bringing in my chart again, if we've got say we have the sun here at the horizon, is Venus an evening star here? Or is she a morning star rising before the sun here? Because if we put the sun over here at the descendant, if Venus is further along in the zodiac, it's going to be visible in the night sky, whereas it's going to be visible in the morning sky if it's over here earlier in the zodiac. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So they thought of her as two really distinct deities in some of these ancient systems too. So they had different, I don't know exactly what the names for her were, but they were thought of as two different deities. And I thought that was really interesting too. So she's associated with beauty, pleasure, magnetism, desire, music, friendship, reconciliations, cleanliness, and ritual. I think these are things that we lose with some of our modern significations. So her abstraction, her desire was to unify and to magnetize, okay, and to reconcile, to bring things together. And because she's of the moon, the night sect, she is collecting things. Now, the mythology behind Aphrodite is really, I think, really important for Venus. So Venus, I was doing some research for this podcast and going back to some of the mythological stories. And if you go back to the ones that weren't like really, I guess you could say, toned down for children, they're pretty, pretty intense, right? So one of the stories, I guess there's two ways that Venus came into being. One was that Zeus had another illicit affair with some kind of mortal, and she came into being that way. The other was that I believe that they had Saturn severed the testicles of his father Uranus, and those testicles fell into the sea, and from that semen it mixed with sea foam, and from that combination Aphrodite was born. So it was one of the first like virginal birth stories, which I thought was pretty interesting. And she emerged from the ocean as this beautiful, glowing, phosphorescent, like jellyfish type of, she wasn't a jellyfish, but she was glowing like a jellyfish, right?
Yeah.
And she was glowing so beautifully that she was adorned by all of these different, like, you know, by the graces of the seasons, right? The three, in ancient Greek astrology, this is something new to me too, that they only recognized, I think, 3 seasons. They didn't really recognize fall. And this is something, and I'm not, I don't know if I have confirmation from multiple sources, but I was reading at one source that was saying that they really only recognized 3 seasons. So hence the association with the 3 graces.
Sure,
But,
they must have been living in Colorado.
yeah, well, in the Mediterranean, they didn't really have as distinct of demarcations between the seasons as we do here in North America and in this latitude that we're living in, you know?
Sure.
So we can think about Venus as just glowing with her inner essential nature and then things coming to her, right? And when Venus is in good condition, like if she's in her own domicile of Taurus or Libra, things just come to her, right? When she is in Mars's house, which is associated with actively pursuing something, she's said to be in her exile, where she may be trying to get something and pursue it actively rather than letting it come to her. Now, I know that you were saying you have this condition in your chart with Venus in its exile, but you have Mars in its exile. So there's this mutual reception that's mitigating that, right?
Yes, they have helped each other. Thank God.
Yeah. Because I've seen other examples where people have trouble in their love life or in like bringing things to themselves because they may take actions trying to pursue it when the proper energy would be to let it come to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is a fierce position to have Venus in Aries. And if you have it, you know what I'm talking about, because she's down to hunt.
Yes, the huntress.
Yes.
Absolutely. And there are definitely lessons to be learned from that too. Like it's, you know, I think we need to get past this kind of like, oh, look at my chart, it's so good, or look at my chart, it's so bad. It's like, no, there may be experiences that you have that you might not like due to some of the positions of your chart, but there's always something to glean and to learn from those. We all have different cosmic lessons, I think, that or ways, not even just lessons, but ways that we can react and ways that we can build character from our experience of our life. You know, I think that's the way I like to think about it.
Yeah, me too. That's how I teach it too. So
one other thing I wanted to talk about with Venus, because I've been having this conversation with a few different people too, and I would be remiss to not mention that Venus has qualities, two things of her role in ancient Greek civilization. One was as a ritual goddess. So she had associations with, you know, the kind of purification rituals that were associated with worshiping the divine. So cleanliness is really important. And the other thing that she was responsible in the Greek city structure was the purity of the Greek dramas. Now, in ancient Greek civilization, they had these great plays, these great dramas that were helping to provide catharsis for the community. So think about art and Venus being associated with artistic expression, excuse me. So what is the purpose of art? It's to express and reflect. And you can see this in the symbol of Venus possibly being a mirror, or Aphrodite's mirror. It is reflecting our emotions back to society. The role of an artist, and I was a professional musician for many, many years. And I taught these songwriting classes where I talked about the role of the artist as reflecting their reality back to the public. Sure. And I think that was Venus's role in that ancient civilization. Was she was responsible for making sure that what was reflected back to the masses allowed for a proper cathartic expression. And catharsis is basically being able to process those heavy emotions and so that we can release them, so that they're not, creating all this tension, right? Mm-hmm. And look at our singers, like our best singers in our cultures. It is this release, it is this kind of like cathartic emotional process that we're going through. I just thought that was really beautiful, because a few people that I've been talking to, and I had this thought a few months ago when I was, again, having some discussions with my teacher, Achuta Baba, aka Adam Ellenboss. And then also I heard this concept was talked about also by Samuel Reynolds in his talk about Pluto. And this thought that if you subscribe to the octave theory with the outer planets, that these planets are a higher octave of one of the 7 planets, because this is one of the ways that they use to describe the outer planets. People have thought of Pluto as a higher octave of Mars, but I'm going to make the argument that Pluto is a higher octave of Venus. And you can even see this in the symbol. And Sam Reynolds was talking about this as well. Look at what we have here. Here's Venus. Here is Pluto. Okay. The symbol of Venus is literally within Pluto. And if we think of Pluto as expressing deep emotions from underneath the surface, like Hades was the ruler of the underworld, and this purification, this transformation, it is very Venusian. Because the question that I posed to my teacher, because he teaches to when we're learning Hellenistic astrology for the first time, his advice is to see if you can come up with significations of the outer planets with the 7 visible planets, and kind of like take them out of your practice for a period of time, because astrology was practiced for thousands and thousands of years with just these 7 visible planets, and then be able to add them back in to see if they have a different type of meaning, signification, and experience. Because I think that the beauty of that is being able to reclaim the power of these 7 visible planets, because we tend to gravitate a lot in modern astrology towards giving a lot of the significations to the outers. And I think they have their role for sure. I'm not a purist when it comes to that. I use them in my practice. I just use them slightly differently. But seeing Venus and Pluto as that higher octave, I think is really interesting. And thinking about this kind of purification that we're going through, this transformation that we're going through right now, this great catharsis as a society. It's really important, because we're getting to the point with Saturn Pluto conjunction and with Jupiter being there, where the catharsis got to a bubbling point. We had repressed all of these unconscious biases. We'd repressed all this anger, this emotion, this sadness, this despair, this inequality, and now it is bubbling to the surface, saying, no, it needs to be dealt with, or the health of the state and the republic and the community is no longer going to function anymore. Yeah. And I see that related to Venus as well.
Yeah, and absolutely.
And think about this with Venus going retrograde too, is as far as cleanliness and like, coronavirus and stuff, we're seeing like, we did a decent job, I think, of social distancing at the beginning. And that now we have this kind of quality too, where we're having people maybe getting together in these large groups, and the qualities of, there may be some qualities where we're not being as, what is the word I'm looking for? Vigilant about hygiene when we're getting together in these great masses. And that may contribute to a later, I don't know, a second wave of the virus or something like that too. Now, I don't want to get too far into the current event type of quality, but because I think that there's justification in a lot of the gatherings as well, and people have different opinions on that. But it just shows you the really multivalent nature of the reality that we're living in right now, as we're being asked to hold these very challenging concepts right now. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like, it's very
absolutely.
mercurial.
And it's unsure and it's uncertain, and it is a free floating of anxiety and emotions and thoughts. And it is, we're definitely living the space of the semi-permeable membrane,
Yes.
for
Yes.
certain. And it's interesting too, though, in that concept of Venus and Pluto, because it's almost the place where it's like, from my my greatest pain comes my greatest love.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I mean, I've
Absolutely.
never once seen a phoenix just kind of gently burn out, like that's not ever been the process. Those, they like gotta like torch and scream and like suffer, and then they come out as beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely a complex and but also a beautiful time that we're living through. I have hope. I do have hope
Yeah. Oh yeah.
that a lot of what we're going through is a necessary contraction, so that we can have a later flowering of a more just and fair society.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I don't know if you've had people that have talked about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions on your show recently. But
Yep.
that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. In ancient astrology, they had time markers where the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn happened roughly once every 20 to 30 years, but they happened in similar elements. And they happen in similar elements every 200 to 250 years. And we're having one of the first, besides an outlier in the early 80s,
Yeah.
the first of the
Libra.
Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, right? In air signs. And that talks to a whole new type of shared idealism as a community and as a society. So this is a huge shift that we're going through. It's not a normal shift. It's a huge paradigm shift. It is like, we're not going to be able to recognize our shared belief systems, our shared society, our shared everything, our shared reality after we've gone through this change. And that brings us to Saturn, right? So one of the cool things about Saturn, so we've talked about the planets that give life. And here we're going to talk about the malefic planets that are the antithesis of life, and that are helping to bring contraction and helping to bring that process of death and decay. And it's hard to talk about sometimes, because as human beings, generally we like things that are more about growth and about birth and life, especially in the West, because we have a narrative that we've grown up in, a narrative that, especially with capitalism, that growth is what is to be venerated, right? And that is where we have to like keep building, keep growing. What are our quarterly earnings and things like that? If we feel like we've failed if we have a bad quarter or something like that, right? And you have a doctorate in business, so I'm sure that you had some of these kind of things going around.
This is like a bad quarter. When we look at it, especially under the view of how heavy Saturn can be on the way to growth, this is where in many businesses, and we've seen it since people have been businessing, this is like suicide level.
Sure.
Right? Like, I cannot believe I failed, instead of working the Saturn, which is
right.
This happens.
Well, and think about how much people who have built their lives around the exponential growth model must be feeling that how they are a failure right now.
Absolutely.
Whereas we have to think about it if we think about it as part of a greater cycle, that takes away that failure mindset and says, no, this is out of your control. This is bigger than you,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
go ahead.
And if Saturn is that, because I teach Saturn as the energy who's going to come, he's very serious. He's not really interested in whether or not you are prepared to move on, but he
Right.
is trying to take you to the next level, because this is where you will be able to sustain. This is where you will only stay in the failure mind frame, you know?
Right.
And so now, as we look at it in society, and Saturn has made his little touchdown into
Yeah.
Aquarius, I essentially look at so many of these businesses and go, where are you online? Where
Right.
is your social community around your work? Where is your give? You know, and that is all that Saturn has said, is like, you cannot sustain in the I'm just brick and mortar structure for
Right.
so many businesses, you know, but that's a much different place to view that, as opposed to, I've had this business for 30 years, it's seeing a downfall, suicide, death. It doesn't have to be that.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Because I think that, a lot of folks are going through an enormous existential crisis
Mhm.
because they don't have this type of planetary awareness. And I
Yeah.
really think that's the beauty of astrology, is when we have, this is where we talk about the pronoia, or the foreknowledge, is if you understand these cycles, you're going to be able to prepare for the future flowering by, maybe contracting on
Yeah.
some level, or
Mhm.
changing, right? This is all about change. And this is really what all these planets are about, is change. You know what I'm saying? Is it's an, and I think that,
Yeah.
and I'll say this again at the end, but the beauty of astrology that the lesson I've taken from my astrology teacher is that these planets keep spinning around, but we have to be able to connect with the center. We have to be able to connect with the
Yeah.
center of the wheel and of the eternal, unchanging, eternal spirit soul. And if we let ourselves get tossed about by all the material changes, that's when we have anxiety. That's when we are not at peace. And really, peacefulness is an internal state. It is both. It is an internal state and an external state. But to find true divine peace, it definitely is an inner journey, where we can
Mhm.
be the eye in the storm. We can be the eye of the hurricane, and where, even though we are going through these changes, we become unflappable, right?
Yeah.
And we become connected with that eternal self.
Absolutely. And it has been brilliant, because we all got sent home to
I know.
contemplate the center, right?
Yep.
And in a
Yep.
very, very universal way,
Yeah.
regardless of what the religious or spiritual practice is. I think this is why astrology will make a great rise again, because what we can all agree on are the seasons, are the movements, is what
Yep.
is outside of us that we can see and dig our feet into. And that doesn't have any specific text. It is simply, where are you in the season? And we can all connect to that
Absolutely.
universally. It's beautiful. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to see where the
Yeah.
astrology takes people in terms of reconnecting to the center of just what's already out there.
Yes. Absolutely. You know what I want to do? I want to talk about Mars first, because I think Saturn should be last.
Okay.
Like, I think Saturn should be the kind of the whole. So I'm gonna look at. Whoops. So let's look at. Hold on a second.
Still Saturn.
Come on,
Saturn
Saturn.
is demanding his screen
Okay,
time
hold
right
on.
now,
I
y'all.
know. So I'm gonna share this in a different way here. Um, Hold on. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, this is so great. I'm just looking at the comments too. And yep, absolutely. Things, yeah, getting good grades. We pull that down to a personal level. That is certainly
Right.
one of those, did I do well kind of energies, which is interesting, because my experience too of education in general, traditional academic education, is as you continue to go on further and further, they more and more start telling you that it is not about the grade. You have to go think, you have to pull your sources, you have to find your center in your education. So that is something that I was really surprised about. So if you're thinking about continuing your education, you'll see much, I think, of the same structure that we're experiencing now.
Yes.
Whereas you're pulled away from, you got an A. Nobody cares about that anymore. They want to know your sources.
Yes. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where my. Come on now.
It's run off. I'm telling you, Saturn is
Well, there's two different ways to like scroll through this, and this one is making it difficult. And I wanted to make it so that I can get out of full screen here. There we go. Okay, sorry about this. Thanks for, I want slideshow. That's what I want. Okay, good. Okay. So if we think about Mars first as the lesser malefic, Mars has a quality of severing, of cutting. It has like its will is to separate. The medieval astrologers gave it qualities of being very hot and very dry because of its proximity in the celestial sphere model to the sun. And it has, we think of it mythologically as the god of war, the god of, anger. It is our willpower, it is action. If the sun commands action, if it is the commanding quality, Mars is what is taking the action. It was associated with fevers, plagues, war, brutality, rage, violence, the military, banishment, sexual intercourse because of its association. It looks like a phallus, right? It's kind of the active yang principle, and it has these kind of it is like the qualities of drought too. So think about if you have if we go back to our garden metaphor, it's too hot, it's too dry. We have the plant is going to, the ground is going to separate. Okay. When you have water that is removed, it is going to move away from you've got these cracks in the wood or cracks in the soil, and everything's going to dry out and the fruit is going to fall off the vine. And this happens too as we get closer to the end of the summer too, is we've got that extreme heat that is causing that separation. Mars in its most positive form, though, can be about courage and protection and about using that will, that ability to fight for a cause that you believe in. And it's the way it's expressed can be definitely, we can see it based on the condition of that planet. The poetic name for Mars was, I believe you say it Puerdes. I don't know how to pronounce that one particular, but it was called the fiery one. And we take meaning from its appearance being red and fiery, and also with its proximity to the sun. They called it Martis, as well as the Greeks would call it Ares. The Babylonians, I believe the Babylonians called it Nergal, and we also call it Kuja. So I think that it's important to think about it as a severing quality, and we can see it manifest in warriors, soldiers, knives, iron, surgeons, cooks. Okay, so both cooks and surgeons are associated with Mars, and because they use fire and they use sharp implements to do their work. Mm-hmm. And when I've been in my practice, I've seen the way that Mars is manifesting right now is it is in the sign of Pisces, and it's drawing energy from Jupiter. So the way that Schmidt describes this, and I think this is really interesting to understand the planets, is he's saying that we have the planetary essence is a verb, and the sign that it's moving through is like the noun. The planet that's providing for the sign is like the noun. So if I were to say what Mars is doing right now is that we are Marsing Jupiter. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So we are severing and we are cutting Jupiterian belief systems, old hierarchical structures. Do you see how that works?
Yep.
I thought that was brilliant because I've been really practicing making astrological sentences like that. So just like Venus right now is, we are Venusing or harmonizing Mercury. We are trying to bring harmony to disparate belief systems, to things that are to duality. But it's suffering right now because it's retrograde, and retrograde planets have a little bit more difficulty bringing what they mean into their into being. So I'm gonna move forward from Mars because we're gonna be here all day if I don't.
I know.
So let's go back to Saturn.
We can also see Mars just on our calendar, and if we think about kind of how the week goes, we do Lunes, Monday, Martes, and of course the male guy's here, but by the time we get to Tuesday, we're ready to separate and take care of tasks.
Yes, take care of business. And that's a wonderful way to get into harmony with the planets, is to understand their nature and try to do activities based on their nature for the days of the week. I know that I'm with you. I'm much more active on Tuesdays. I'm like, I'm ready to get stuff done. I'm ready to do stuff. Whereas I'm much more reflective on Mondays. I kind of rest. I take care of my body. I take care of being able to process everything that and reflect upon the actions of the week prior and gather resources and information so that I can take action the next day. And here we're on Mercury's day, and we're communicating all these intellectual things, which I think is a great day for that.
Yeah. Okay.
Saturn. So Saturn's the big baddie in the sky. Like a lot of the challenging stuff that we associated with the outer planets, the ancients thought of Saturn in this way. Saturn was like the outermost sphere in the what is it, the Chaldean order, and in the Ptolemaic model, it was the most distant from the Earth. So we have this quality of distance, of isolation, of being far away from us, of exile. And it's very dim. It's like when its appearance in the sky is like this kind of dim yellow castor. You know what castor oil is?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like this yellowish liquid. So it was thought of as dull and dim. And it was the antithesis of light, even though we call it Phaenon, which is the shining one, which is interesting. Like, I mean, I guess all the planets have some quality of light associated with them. But they called Saturn Saturnus, Kronos in the Greek system, Ninturna, and Shani in Jyotisha. It was the greater malefic because of its relationship above the sphere of the sun. One interesting thing about Saturn is that it was associated with agriculture. So like the salt of the earth, like anything that was like hard labor was associated with Saturn.
The timekeeper.
Yes, exactly. Father Time, the god of sickness and death, of old age. Saturn was depicted as like a crippled body in the ancient system, or with a scythe that was like harvesting grain or harvesting souls. So Saturn was the harvester of souls as well. Long-lasting punishment, tears, accusations, concealments. Another thing I like to talk about with Saturn that it was shocking to me when I first learned it is they associated Saturn with actors, where you'd be like, actors, that's a weird one. But in many of the ancient texts, they said that Saturn was the great deceiver and was feigning appearances. So what are we doing when we are acting? We are feigning an appearance. We are trying to be something that we are not. And I thought that was really interesting. So it's sort of the antithesis of life. So we talk about childlessness, labors, forced activities. Also, the concept of discipline, structure. Saturn is both the building of structures and the decay of structures, the quality of entropy, where forms are dissolving and decaying, which also has some significations with Pluto, right? That entropic forces. And when it manifests into form, we have places like dark caves. We have elders, we have widows, farmers. We have wise people, okay? And its planetary will is to exclude and to reject. Now, in the traditional system, it rules both the houses of Capricorn and Aquarius, which I think is really fascinating because each of the non-luminary planets rules two particular houses. They have a diurnal expression and a nocturnal expression, a kind of a masculine home, a yang home, and a yin home. And Capricorn in the yin form, that we've been experiencing all this contraction energy, on a personal level, but on a structural, physical level. Whereas when Saturn is moving into Aquarius, which it has recently, we're going to be finding those contractions on an idealistic level. We're going to be seeing a restructuring on our belief systems and how we order society versus how we are ordering our material, physical resources. And I think that's really interesting to see because we're already having all these conversations about how do we really live idealistically as a society, and what needs to contract physically. So I think that what we're going to see when Saturn retrogrades back into Capricorn is, again, more entropy with the physical structure of society. And then as it moves back into Aquarius, we will continue on these conversations about how do we restructure our ideals and our collective shared reality.
Absolutely. Well, and when we saw the conjunction in Libra in the 80s there, we have an opportunity of like a mini experience of mass information becoming available. And so we have that again now as we move towards the conjunction in Aquarius. It's mass information. It brings a transparency to the surface where there's no hiding from the information. And therefore, if we can see the truth, we can restructure an ideal.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so it'll be interesting.
Well, and piggybacking off of that thought, one interesting way of thinking about Saturn and Mars in particular is their relationship to their planetary joy. So the planetary joy is a concept where the ancients would place a planet in a particular house and say, this has a correlation, this house has a correlation with the significance of this planet. Okay.
Sure.
So Saturn would take its joy in the 12th house, whereas Mars would take its joy in the 6th. And we really have to think about the concepts of sect when we talk about this too, because Saturn is the diurnal sect, which is related to the sun and about taking action based on awareness, whereas Mars is related to the realm of fortune or 2K. Okay, we can say Saturn is nemesis and Mars is 2K. And we have the house of bad fortune, the 6th house, where we may be experiencing challenges, accidents, illnesses, injuries that aren't necessarily based on the actions that we've taken. They are more, 2K was the distribution of fate that was more random. And that is more associated with the concept of the lunar sect. Whereas the solar fate, nemesis, and was sort of like the distribution of fate that was more based on an awareness of our own actions. Sure. So if we think about it like that, we have things that we may receive, good fortune that we may not have earned with Venus in the 5th house. And we have bad fortune that we may not necessarily have earned with Mars in the 6th house. But we have the negative experiences that may be a result of our actions with Saturn in the 12th house. And we have the good fortune that we experience by Jupiter having its joy in the 11th house due to our merits. So Jupiter, you can consider more merit-based rewards, and Saturn more punitive justice. Okay, so think about Saturn as like punishment, if we think about Saturn as punishment, but also as redemption. And I like to think about Saturn in regards to this, the Shawshank Redemption. Are you familiar with that movie?
Yes.
One of my favorite movies. I love it. It's such a masterpiece because it talks about hope within places of despair. As a 12th house sun, as my experience of this, like that's my life, is Shawshank Redemption on some level, where I feel like, I've lived in sort of this prison and I've had to find a way to have the power of my own soul to guide me through that, the power of my own hope through difficult circumstances to bring about liberation. Because I think that that's what Saturn does. And in Austin Coppock's really great book, 36 Faces, I had this kind of revelation reading his chapter on Libra, because he talks about Saturn being exalted in Libra, which is about bringing balance back to our experience. Yeah. And if you think about punishment and punitive justice, what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring balance back into our experience from maybe some actions that we took that are either no longer serving us anymore or are out of alignment with our higher self and with our divinity. So Saturn, our experience in the 12th house, you could see of it as, yeah, you are in a prison, you are in isolation, but what do you choose to do with that isolation? What do you choose to do with that prison sentence? Do you learn something? Because ultimately, what is idealistically, now I know this isn't how the American prison system works, but idealistically, going to prison should be about rehabilitating that citizen so that they can rejoin society. Now we could talk all we want about the systemic, racism and the systemic slavery that the prison system has become, okay, which is, it is not functioning in that manner. But the idealism behind it is that to rehabilitate a citizen, to have them rejoin again. And I think Saturn plays that role. It plays that redemptive role in rebalancing us. But it is definitely like when we experience our Saturn returns, a lot of people know about Saturn as far as the Saturn return. It is a maturation. And what do we do in a maturation process? It's a transition and a release from our youth to our middle age. And then we have a second Saturn return from our middle age to our elderhood. And I don't know about you, but in my Saturn return, I was asked to release many of my old youthful habits that did not serve who I was at that moment anymore.
Absolutely.
And that can be painful. That takes a lot of mental discipline. That takes a lot of like saying, you know what, I don't want to do this, but I need to. So they also associate Saturn with the concept of necessity, which is like, these are the things that you have to do that may not be pleasant, but they are necessary. And that's really, that way of thinking of Saturn and how it joys in the 12th house has really brought a lot of redemptive hope to some of the experiences I've had as a 12th house sun and Mercury. Because when you first start learning in traditional astrology and you're like, you start using whole sign houses, like I went here, listen to this mind bender. I went from in the Placidus system of having an 11th house sun and Mercury to a 12th house sun and Mercury in the traditional system. And those two houses are very, very different in the way that you think about your life. And I really resonated with that shift because my life was not speaking to an 11th house experience. My life was speaking to a 12th house experience. And at first it was very depressing. Like when I first started learning traditional astrology, it was when Uranus was shaking things up in my 9th house of belief and completely shaking my core fundamental belief system. And it is unsettling. It is destabilizing. But as I've come to terms with it, it's helped me become more of a spiritual adult rather than a spiritual child. And I really think that's what Saturn's role is how do we become spiritual adults? And just like Saturn, just like adults and parents, if you're a parent, are you a parent? You're a parent.
I'm a parent.
Right? Okay. Part of being a good parent, Stormie, is we have to be able to say no to our children. We have to be able to bring structure. We have to provide limitations for them. If we have a toddler and their will says, I want to run into the middle of the street, and they start taking off and they're subject to their whims, are we going to say, yeah, do whatever you want, create your own reality?
Good. Vision board that before you go.
No, as parents, we're going to be like, no, I'm sorry. Here is a boundary. You're going to run out into the street and you're going to grab that little child and you're going to say, no, this is not what we're going to do for their own physical safety. And I think that's what Saturn's doing to us on a lot of levels. Saturn is like taking our little toddler selves when we're trying to like run out into the middle of a crowded street and saying, nope, I love you. I'm going to guide you this way. And here's some boundaries. It's children need structure. I really believe this. I'm not a best friend parent. I'm more of a structured parent. Doesn't mean I can't be friendly with my children. It just means that I don't believe in like being best friends with them. The power structure is not one of equality. It is one of parent and child. And that's important to be able to nurture their growth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I teach that as Saturn as our spiritual maturity planet, because when we have a moment of maturity that is like a moment of mental maturity, that can be gone like a flash in the pan. But Saturn being concerned with time and structure and something long lasting, if I shift and mature spiritually, it will touch every area of my life in an unshakable way. Because I've had these little grown-up mental moments where I'm like, oh, I was so adult right there. And it's gone. It is gone. But in the work of Saturn is something sustainable. And it does change my every interaction by showing me the structure.
Well, and longevity is a good point too. Saturn causes structures to decay, but it also it causes structures to endure. So it is an endurance that quality to it. Here's another interesting way of thinking about how these planets can manifest. And this is again something I've really been working through as I learned through Austin Kopic's work with the decans. Is each of the planets manifests through a certain portion of the zodiac, and you can think of like if we thought of like Jupiter as a place of relative ease, right, where something may come naturally or easy to us, and we may be working towards merit-based actions, or Venus, where something just comes to us that is good, right? So like Stormie, if you thought about your Venus, what degree is your Aries Venus in?
They're both at 0.
Okay, so your first decan Aries Venus. So what might come naturally to you just through doing nothing is an ability to say, this is who I am, right? This is because that first decan is about severing from the it has a quality of like saying this is what I am and this is what I'm not. So you may have a natural ability to say this is what I am and this is what I'm not, and that may just come naturally to you, right? Whereas like I have Venus in the second decan of Gemini, which is all about trying to hold dualities.
Yeah.
So I may have a natural ability to say, well, you come from this belief and you come from this belief, and like maybe we could find some middle ground. Like I know that that's a desire that I have too, a deep desire to like unify opposite viewpoints, right? Mm-hmm. So if we extend that to Saturn may be a point in your chart, because it was associated with darkness and of hardship, where you may have been denied that in your youth. It may have been extra difficult for you to do that particular area of the zodiac. And through hard work, through time, through maturation, you can incorporate that quality into your life. Now, here's one example. I have Saturn in the third decan of Virgo, and that decan is associated with coming to terms with the fallibility of matter. It is the end of Virgo season where we're saying, okay, all forms eventually have to decay.
Gotta go away sometime.
Right. And I was terrified of death as a young person, terrified of it. I did not want to acknowledge it even existed. I was, Taurus, Moon, Cancer, Sun. I'm all about springtime and birth and growth, right?
Let's just do that.
Right. Let's just do that. But I had to come to terms through experience, through like seeing family members get sick, seeing through some of my elders passing away and their physical forms decaying, and that process of entropy, coming to terms with that quality. And that's me doing Saturn. And even with my own body, during my Saturn return, I tore my ACL. I blew out my knee. And I had to come to terms with the fact that my body was also, it was not eternal, but my spirit may be, but my body is fallible. And I had to come to terms with that. And I had to do the hard work to repair my body during my Saturn return. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There's Saturn return is like no joke. There's no joke. You're going to really do some work. I mean, and mine was solidly around relationships. I mean, I've got a Saturn that's in Libra. It was very much so into this space of what's yours, what's mine, right?
And in the second house too, right?
Yeah, and in the second house, and 17 degrees. I had a lot to stop and to think about and to really work through that. I had a lot to work through with money just in general. But I tell you what has come of that is like, it's so funny. I keep telling the story, but I was doing taxes last year and my two statements didn't match. And I was like, no, I can tell you where I spent $1.36 now because I did my Saturn work. So if something is not right, I know it, right? Because I'm like, I know about my money, friends. Okay.
So Stormie, I have Saturn in the second house too. So the secondary quality of my Saturn return was I started budgeting because I didn't pay any attention to my budget. And I was like, I would just be like, oh, well, I don't know where money is. I'd constantly overdraft my account and get charged extra fees and all that. And I finally like started budgeting and took, awareness of my resources seriously. And that was a complete shift in my maturation process. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's funny. So in the relationship zone, I just have to share this in case some of y'all are going to experience this. But the other thing is I always had this idea that I was maybe going to be a doctor or do something like that. And I have had an opportunity in my life to date some of the most lovely human beings that are out there, right?
Right.
But what would always happen, I had this high Libra business where I would attract these men to me they made good money and they wanted to take care of me. And
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what happened. Saturn return happened. And I was like, well, why don't I just take care of my damn self? And
Yeah.
then, right. And that attracted a whole different grouping of people, which there was nothing wrong with this.
Right.
But based on the direction of my chart, that was never how it was going to be. Because, what happened after that is people came and they're like, I just want to take care of you. And I'm like, oh, hell, I don't have time for that. Like, you need to take care of you. I'll take care of me. And then we can be together. How about that? But
did you meet your partner at near your Saturn return?
I met my partner at my Saturn return and we were so different. And we had a Saturn return at the same time. And we were like, no, thank you. Let's just be friends. And 7 years later, we were like, oh my God, it's you.
Yeah, I similar experience. A lot of people, I've heard this a lot. A lot of people meet their life partners at a Saturn return.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like here's some interesting, just even further signification. So in my Leo ascending chart, Saturn is responsible for the 7th house of relationships and the 6th house of injuries and illnesses. So I met my partner in like November of starting my Saturn return. I blew my knee out in February. And this is when the beginning of our relationship. And it accelerated our commitment to one another.
Sure.
Because like I actually just really needed her help to get through that injury. And we started being much more committed to one another because of that injury. So look at the connection of like an injury and a partnership in the chart. I just thought that was just really fascinating, as far as like how it plays out and how it's responsible for those different areas of life.
Yeah.
I've learned to love Saturn. I mean, I really was afraid of it for a long time, but I've really become much more Saturnian. There's another timing technique in Hellenistic astrology called zodiacal releasing. And what you do is you have a house or a planet that's activated as a time lord for your life. It's like a chapter of your life. And through my 20s, I had Jupiter as a time lord where I was a professional musician. I was a teacher and my 5th house was activated. So I was doing a lot of things with, entertainment, with art, the arts, with like, teaching those things. I was a music teacher and the themes of my children were very much prominent. And then at my early 30s, I shifted to Capricorn and to Saturn. And I almost immediately was like, I'm shifting. I need to take my life more seriously. I need to do this serious thing. And it was really, really visible in my life and in my mindset. And I had become just much more like less about Jupiterian optimism and much more about Saturnian realism.
Yeah.
And not to say that either one of those is bad. I just noticed it in my character. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Cause it's a like full soul shift that happens where it's just like, oh, I'm just not anymore, or I'm just not right now, and on to the next. It's so beautiful if you know kind of what's going on. And even if you don't, I think we can look back at people in the period of 3.5 to 5 years, just depending on which planet you're tracking, and you're different. You're just different. If your progressed moon has moved on, you're different.
Well, and one last point about Saturn and its relationship with Capricorn and Aquarius. Now, it is, if you remember, I showed you in that Thema Mundi and the traditional rulerships. Saturn is in opposition in the Thema Mundi to the 2 lights. So it has this kind of, it's the antithesis of light. And we can see this in our essential dignities too, where the sun is in its exile in the sign of Saturn, in the sign of Aquarius, and the moon is in its exile in the sign of Capricorn. So it's kind of like they're in a house where they're trying to provide vitality and light, but they are being provided for by the quality of death and decay and contraction when they're in those houses. So I think that that's just really fascinating, especially with, we see Saturn right now. If we're bringing it back to our current reality, Saturn moving through the first decan of Aquarius talks about the mark of exile. Austin Coppock talks about that in his book 36 Faces, the mark of exile, where we see a defeat in the tarot, where we see a figure that there was a battle, there was a defeat, and we see someone collecting the resources, and we see someone walking off into the distance as the loser, so to speak. And what we're doing right now is we are seeing that the people on the fringes of society, we're having a redemptive crisis right now, a crisis of how do we redeem the people that have been excluded from being in the crowd. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So with this movement that we're seeing in our society and in the news, we're saying, Saturn is saying, nope, you have to mature with the people that have been rejected by society over the long course of your history. And we are bringing redemption and hope back through doing the hard work of restructuring, the hard work, you know?
Yeah. And that's it's not just race though. That's the thing I want to throw in there. It's not just race. I mean, we can look very specifically, since this is an astrology channel, in the field of astrology, right? Those people were kicked out for a while. These are the people who have not been in on the in crowd, but even in the field itself, in the race itself, there has had to be a restructuring. Here in astrology, we've gone back and said, hold on, how do we really take people who are practicing and bring them to the next level? Make sure that we have something we can say this person is valid in what they're teaching, what they're sharing. We've had to go back because we are not governed in the United States. We have nothing like that. So it's been also that very Saturnian get it together uprising that has been happening even within this industry.
And it manifests in multiple forms too. Oppression is not exclusive to race, right?
Oh, no.
Race is just one way you can experience oppression. You can experience economic oppression. You can experience oppression based on your gender or your sexual orientation. All of those things are forms of oppression, right?
Sure. Pick a thing.
Yeah, it's like, and many of these structures of oppression are being examined right now simultaneously, especially like an economic one as well. We're seeing like the height of corporate oligarchy, where we have, this was part of that Occupy Wall Street movement too, where we had a certain tiny percentage of the population that was consolidating the resources. And we're coming to a point in our collective evolution where we're examining that system as well and saying, well, is this really fair? And how do we, rebalance that particular form of oppression also?
Yeah.
So
it's wild.
So we could see the mark of exile in a lot of different ways. And you're definitely right. It's not just race. That's just one manifestation of that, this has been a real interesting time as far as getting educated on the systems that we're a part of and our biases that we have. And like, I've considered myself fairly liberal, but my parents were like pretty much like head in the sand, type of white people. Like they would, you know what I'm saying? They were not overtly racist, but they were ignoring things based on their privilege because they could. It was just not an awareness.
Sure.
And it's very interesting.
Sphere, they're not gonna jump in and deal.
Yeah. Right. And it's just I'm what I've done over the last few weeks in particular is just really tried to go internal and examine and learn and ask questions and say, where may I be harboring any unconscious bias that I may have that I may not even be aware of?
Absolutely.
And I think that's the best way to handle this energy right now. If we're going to talk about how to deal with the astrology of the moment, and I'm making much less declarative statements, which is Jupiter, and asking more questions, which is Mercury, and educating myself. And I talked about that in my week ahead, and it was hard. These are difficult. It's difficult to self-examine sometimes, and it does make you feel uncomfortable. But I think it's important to live with that discomfort right now, and it's okay to feel discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. And to support each other in the collective discomfort, we've got to ask the questions if we're going to get to the next place. That's why I'm so big. I have made no public statements because I don't have any to make. But the person I am in walking through this is the one that says, whatever your group is, whatever your situation is, I think you also have to be very responsible and accountable for
Yeah,
looking at what you're doing with that and what you will do with it.
sure.
Because we can have all the change on the planet we want to, but if
Yeah,
you are not prepared with the resources you need, including accountability,
right.
to walk forward, we will have made all of these changes and end up back where we are. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So
Yeah.
it is an uncomfortable place where we have to have the conversations of all sorts of things from the past, but then we also have to have that conversation, which I love at this Jupiter Pluto that we're getting ready to have, that says, well,
Well,
what are
and
you doing?
this is a great segue
Yeah,
into Mercury. Like,
I know.
right?
Okay, let's do Mercury. We're never going
Okay.
to be done here.
Are we okay with time? I'm sorry. Like
Yeah,
we're going
let's
super
do
long.
it because we're going to wrap
We
up. I
got
have to
one
actually
more.
teach.
We got one more. Okay. So, yes, if we're talking about the time that we are experiencing now, it is very mercurial. And Mercury was called Mercurius. The Greeks called him Hermes or Hermes. Um, Also, he had names of Nebu and Buddha in the Jyotisha. Stillbone was the gleaming or the glittering one in its poetic name. And Mercury is the scribe of writers. It is someone who is the source of wisdom. It was the patron, it's kind of saint of astrology. It moves very fast and has kind of an erratic kind of way of moving about. So it was the winged messenger. It's associated with science and surprisingly like athletics too. Anything that requires skill. I
Sure.
think that this is when you were talking about reskilling as a business person, that's a very mercurial type of thing because it's not saying I know this, it's saying, oh, how can I learn this? How can I be
Mhm.
taught? It concretizes itself in orators and our speech, also merchants, lawyers, also thieves in its negative way. Like Mercury was kind of a trickster in mythology and was had some various stories about stealing things from people. So that is another way that we can think of its manifestation. But its essential nature and will is to contest something and destabilizing something and to like cast doubt. And we've seen this, with some of our leadership recently. That I believe there's many of the leaders of powerful countries right now are Mercury ruled. There's a lot of Gemini leaders right now, and one of the things that they're very skilled at is casting doubt within their collective, and on some level being very divisive. So there is definitely this quality of like dexterity and trying to like shake things up.
Mhm.
Um, and this is really prominent with the nodes where they are right now.
Oh,
And that is where we get that, we're coming up on a retrograde, a Mercury retrograde, and we may be really re-examining and asking a lot of questions about, particularly with Mercury being in the sign of Cancer, on how we provide nurturing for one another and how we are providing growth and how we're providing sustenance. We're having questions on who is our kin and who is not, like who is part of the group and who isn't.
mhm.
um yeah, it's really fascinating time. I mean, it's scary, horrifying, and hopeful, all wrapped up in one big like you know stress bomb.
Yeah, just like a roller coaster, right? Where you're like, this is
Yes.
going to be so fun, but I could also throw up or lose something. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that, as we were just saying, I think what Mercury asks us right now is to be able to hold opposites and to be able to hold opposing viewpoints and realize that reality is multivalent and there are multiple realities that we're living in simultaneously.
Yep.
And there are some truths that are relative. There are some truths that are more capital T truths. Okay.
Mhm.
But I think that there are definitely ways that they express themselves in different experiences. And
Yep.
as the lawyer, you should be questioning the witnesses right now. You shouldn't be the judge saying, this is what I feel. And
Yeah.
it's so easy, though, to fall into that, though, isn't it?
It
It's
is so
easy.
easy. And it's interesting because I was listening to some statements that were made earlier in the week last week, right?
Mhm.
And I was pissed. And
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
like, absolutely not. That is not true. And I was talking to my spiritual teacher, and I realized as we were talking, I'm like, that is absolutely a truth in that person's reality,
Right.
not like some delusional reality in that community.
Right.
That is what that community has seen, you know, as opposed to, and so it's the truth that we can have multiple truths simultaneously. So
Right.
I can't be being the judge. I have to be the listener a
Yeah.
lot right now. And that is a good position, because just because it's not true in my reality doesn't make it not true.
That's absolutely right. And I'll tell you, just an interesting way of holding duality is, so my partner is Black and my stepdad is a police officer. So I've had those
Okay.
two of those experiences. I've had conversations with both of those
Yeah.
people, and trying to see things from both of those perspectives
Mhm.
has been really, really interesting to see the shared lived experiences and how their realities are completely
Yeah.
drawing on different experiences.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
having to learning to reconcile those things, mostly it just comes from asking questions, and
Yeah.
through saying, well, what is your experience? What has this been as a reality for you? Where are you coming from?
Yep.
What caused you to believe this, or what caused that experience, or caused you to feel that way? And then where do we meet and find the reconciliation? You know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and
Ugh, it's a good time for that. It is
it's
a
tough.
beautiful time for that. I think it's
Yeah,
actually really the only way forward, you know, because being too partisan on any issue, whatever it is, pick a thing, blocks out any of this real good, like Gemini, Mercury,
yeah,
juju we've got going right now, where we get to listen and learn.
right.
So,
At
yeah.
the same time, I will say this. My one declarative statement that hopefully that you'll allow me is that in my weekly forecast, I did say, sometimes, and this has a Gemini Venus, and you probably has a Mercury Venus. We want to hold all the options and all the dualities,
Hmm.
and it maybe feel sometimes uncomfortable to make a declarative statement and to speak out against something because we want to see all the different perspectives. I
Sure.
know it's very uncomfortable for me, and this is where the hard work that I've been doing. It's very uncomfortable for me to think that people dislike me, or to say something that would, like, as a Leo ascendant, like, this is, you
You
see
know,
this with
that's
our president too. He freaks out if people don't like him, right? Or
sure.
if he feels like people don't like him. And
Sure.
I feel this. I feel this. I understand that impulse. But there does come a point where we have to take a risk
Hmm.
of saying, no, I do. There is a point where this is something that I reject, and
Yeah.
this is something that I believe in. And I
Oh,
tried
yeah.
to take more of that risk in my forecast, while still holding space to be wrong, to know that I may not have the entire picture right
Yep.
now. Like, I can say the murder of Black people by the police is wrong uncategorically, and
Yeah.
say that I reject that. I can say that with absolute certainty,
Right.
while I still can hold some of the duality. We're seeing that there may be some other truths and realities within that multivalent nature,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I think that, we're going to be faced with educating ourselves, but also with the courage to say what your truth is,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
both. It's really both.
And it's going to be interesting because I think I've had many of the same experiences as you have with that. And it's like also being right in the sweet spot of timing, just timing, right? And
Right.
I love that. I feel like whether it's through that physical body or the spiritual body or the emotional body, whichever one it comes through, we all find the timing, I
Right.
think,
Well,
especially if you're sitting on the internet, on camera, or on a podcast, the moment comes when the truth comes out, and that timing is when it's beautiful.
and I'll tell you what, being in a relationship with a person of color does not make me an expert on race relations either. Like,
Oh yeah.
we have so many unconscious biases that are just, um,
Yeah.
that we really have to, like, dig up. And it's because, just as, you know, Black people were born into a system so were the rest of us. And we
Mhm.
have this system that we are living within that sometimes we don't become aware of because we didn't have to become aware of it, because
Sure.
we were benefiting from it. So that's been a real, it takes a lot of hard work, but I think ultimately we're really going to benefit as a society from this time. I
Yeah.
have hope. I have hope because I see more people asking the questions, and
We're
even,
talking.
right,
We are
exactly.
Geminiing like a mug, right?
Yeah, right
And
now we are, right?
yes, and it's beautiful. And my husband's white too. So it's so
Yeah.
funny. We have, like, I'm sure we have had some of these conversations. And I
Oh
saw
yeah.
this meme on the internet and said, how are those interracial relationships going right now? And I was thinking they're
Yeah.
going powerfully, is how
Yes.
they're going, because we literally have these people to
Yeah.
have some conversations with, and I just
Yeah.
trust that the universe, God, whatever we call it, is up there,
Yeah.
made interracial things happen, because one day we were going to have this conversation. And what better way to do it than in front of the face that you love,
Right. Well,
right?
because it's not just it's not just a this like abstraction for us. This is a person that we live with, that
Absolutely.
that we see them at their best and we see them at their worst, and
Mm,
we have these conversations. We're seeing the humanity within them and seeing what their lived experience
mhm.
of the hierarchical within the system is.
Yeah.
And that's so important. And I think that's another thing I want to really make a point of, is that when we're dealing with these large systemic changes, we are dealing with individual human beings too.
Yeah.
And that is important to really have as a in the back of our minds. It doesn't mean we aren't really trying to make big changes.
Yeah.
It's just that you can do both. You can have, it's like, that's the as above so below. You can have these personal conversations, you can have these personal identifications, and then you can like have it inform how you're going to move out and make the
Absolutely.
systemic changes. So
Yeah. I mean, it's just so
yeah.
much right now, but it's so much, and it is uncomfortable in some moments, but it is also, I think, just increasingly beautiful, because on all sides, whether it's, white people learning about black people or brown people or whatever, it's also making everybody be accountable. Maybe we have not been in certain situations or certain industries because we didn't put ourselves there. That is
Right.
a big thing where the accountability, I think, comes in, but it just all, I think, stems on the beauty of the conversation that's
Yeah.
available now. And Mercury is taking care of, he's taking care of all of that. So in the middle, you just have to sort out the minutia, what's true, what's not, the
Yes.
value of information. Venus
And that's been
retrograde.
hard lately, hasn't it?
Oh
With
my God.
Mars
Yeah.
conjoining Neptune. And if we want to briefly touch on the outer planets, Neptune is associated with illusion, right? Like
Yeah.
where we may be trying to transcend our physical reality, um, but we don't always do it in a way that is healthy. Like Neptune was associated with toxicity and poisons as well. So when Mars conjoins with Neptune and squares the Sun and Venus, a lot of the times it's extraordinarily difficult to get to the truth,
Mm-hmm.
because it's going through all these layers of belief and all these layers of Jupiter that is based on history, based on our lived
Yes.
experience. And the internet's, it's just a it's just, pardon my French, it's just a shit show right now.
Oh, it
Like,
is. It
you
is.
know
It is. Oh man, it is. And it is not just one source.
yeah.
There are, yes. And
Yeah.
Mars in Pisces in general, I
Yeah.
teach this as the water aerobics placement, right? Because it's super good.
Yeah.
Like water aerobics, you get your heart rate up, you're like pumping, but you are not going anywhere fast. You're just
Right.
Martianing, right? You're just like pumping it out. So yeah, that's cool, but you're not really going anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So lots of good
Yeah.
cardio though. We've had a lot of good heart pumping cardio, I
Sure.
think, in our society lately,
It's
but we haven't gotten
absolutely.
anywhere.
Well, and in true mercurial fashion, I could say also that we sometimes we could go the opposite extreme and never believe anything, where
Yeah.
everything becomes a conspiracy theory. It's like,
Yeah.
like, so yeah, I think that from the approach that I'm taking, and just to wrap up Mercury here, is ask questions, be
Wow.
okay with destabilizing a viewpoint, um, open your ears, rather, listening is important before making declarative statements,
Yeah.
and just sometimes we have moments in life where we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And feeling that curiosity of a childlike curiosity, is that can be joyous too.
Mhm.
And it's like looking at all, even though we're dealing with such these heavy things, if we can look at that with the curiosity of a child,
Yeah.
that's when we're really going to start to transcend all the divisions and come to a place where we can really find a consensus.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. I mean, I think really, besides flight, of course, in and of itself, really the only thing that the Wright brothers did right is that they believed they could build a machine that would fly.
Right.
That is the main thing that they did. That level of blind, curious, childlike faith, that was really what they culminated there. What we got as a result from that was planes.
Right.
So, oh my God, we have got to move on because I have to teach in
Sure.
15 minutes.
No, it's been great, Stormie. Thanks for hanging in with us, everybody.
Yeah, I know. And it's so funny. People are like loving it. See, so you get two astrologers together.
Yeah.
And it's questionable on time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And I tend to be somewhat long-winded. So
Oh God, me too. Me too. But man, this has been good. Like I feel like this was really good. I would just absolutely love to have you back. Definitely love to have you on the podcast for sure. And there's so much to teach about. I would love to do that again with you. And it sounds like
and I would love to return the favor too. And we were talking about maybe thinking about doing the kind of the business of astrology and like the new paradigm of, how to get yourself out there with communications and things like that. I think that'd be great. And I'd love to have you on my channel to talk about that too.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'll come over there and we'll just keep talking because that is what we're doing right now. So you guys, thank you everybody for sticking in here with us. This has been fabulous. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. There's been lots of good conversation in the chat. I will make sure that every link ever is available to Spencer in the description box down below. Awesome. And you guys like this video, comment, share, subscribe. If you are listening on the podcast, definitely give it a little bit of a thumbs up over there as well. Okay. All right, you guys, we're going to let you go and blow out of here. And I will see you tomorrow afternoon in another eat and greet with Felina, where we are going to talk about Chiron. So make sure you have your chart so you know where your Chiron's at. And we will see you guys tomorrow afternoon. Thanks, Spencer.
All right. Thanks, Stormie. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.